Retro.
Hi, this is Claudia Gray, the author of several Star Wars books, and you are listening to Dennis and Jay on Podcast Stardust. May the Force be with you.
Welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. I'm Dennis Keithley, and normally this is where my friend and co-host Jay Krebs would introduce herself, but this week she's been on grandmother duty, so I'm going to go solo so that she can take care of some family. But not to worry, Jay will be back on Monday for our regular discussion of the Clone Wars. But as it is Friday, this is normally the time that we'd be discussing recent Star Wars news. However, we generally record these episodes in advance, and all has been quiet on the Star Wars front. That likely has a lot to do with San Diego Comic-Con happening this weekend, but rest assured we'll be covering any Star Wars news announcements that came out of the con or otherwise in next week's episode of the news. So, with there being a absence of Star Wars news, I've decided to pull an audible, and I am going to give you a short review of Kwame Mbalia's Star Wars novel, The Last Order, which came out last November. One last thing before we get started, just like to remind you that you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust. All right, the dish is aligned, the signal's boosted to maximum output, the shield is down, we are now broadcasting the galaxy. Here we go. So, once again, I am going to be discussing The Last Order, which was written by Kwame Mbalia. It's a young adult novel, largely featuring Finn and Jannah. So keep that in mind. The protagonists in young adult books are generally teenagers or young adults, and that does tend to be it is the case in this book, as we are going to be looking largely at Finn and Jannah's time with the First Order in close proximity to when they defected, or went AWOL, whichever you want to say. So I'm going to start off with some non-spoiler discussion, and then I'll end up with some spoiler thoughts and a little bit of the details. I'm going to try and not give away the end of the book, because I do think it is worth reading on your own, so there's a bit of foreshadowing. So here is how the book jacket describes this book. It says, not all orders are meant to be followed. The resistance has defeated the First Order, but remnants of the brutal regime remain. When a shuttle full of child prisoners is rescued by resistance operatives, Finn and Jannah, both of whom were kidnapped and indoctrinated by the First Order at a young age, discover that their former superior major goal appears to still be taking children for his own purposes. Determined to stop him from destroying any other lives, the resistance heroes set off on his trail. But their pursuit stirs up haunted memories of their time as First Order stormtroopers. For Finn, of a doomed mission under Major Goal, and for Jannah, of the events that culminated in her defection on Ansett Island. To set things right, they will have to control not just the evil forces of the present, but the troubled ghosts of their past. So, yeah, that's a pretty good summary. I guess I would amend it just this way, that the discovery of the ship full of refugee children is really a framing device, and we revisit that only periodically throughout the book. The bulk of the book itself really does get into Finn's past and how it doesn't actually get up to when he defects and leaves the First Order, but it sets in motion events that we'll get to. The book that Greg Rucka wrote back prior to The Force Awakens called Before the Awakening, and that leads kind of right into that story. And then for Jannah, it does give us her defection, so we get all of that. But along the way, we also meet another young protagonist by the name of Koi. He joined the Resistance as part of the civilian fleet that showed up at Exegol to take out the Final Order's fleet there that was under command of Darth Sidious, Palpatine, whatever you want to call him. And he comes from an agricultural world whose name escapes me, and I did not put in my notes, but he is a tea farmer, essentially, and his grandfather encouraged him to go do this, and so he ends up being in the right place at the right time. He has thoughts of going home, but when this shuttle of children shows up, he finds himself volunteering to take Finn and Jannah on the mission as well. It is kind of cool. Lando shows up in the beginning of the book as well, but his presence is largely limited to those opening chapters before we get into the heart of the story. So beyond that, what did I think about this book? I have to admit, I really didn't have any expectations, but when I picked it up and started reading it, this book came out last fall, and frankly, I hadn't heard much of anything about it. And I know there's a few friends that have read it, but I must have missed the reviews that they would post online. And so again, I didn't have much in the way of expectations, but as I got into the book, I was perhaps a little bit apprehensive about the stories of young Finn and young Jannah, but I thought they were held, they went along pretty well. It does a good job telling you, a backstory for Jannah, especially since we don't really have much of that outside of the rise of Skywalker. And it also does a good job, as far as I can tell, not stepping on any canon toes. When we started getting Finn's backstory, I was convinced they were going to override Greg Rucka's story from Before the Awakening. And that's a middle grade book, so maybe they wouldn't have had any problems with doing that. But it was still a concern of mine because they seem to be slipping a bit when it comes to following continuity over the past couple of years. But beyond that, I also thought this book did a good job explaining why the stormtroopers or their cadets that were training and working with them would have had a desire to do so. And it largely seems because they get these morale lessons every night that talks about the chaos in the galaxy and the decay of civilization, and that they are there to bring order. And then it goes through the whole regimen of breaking down the individual and making them part of a group, and then promoting that group as a force for good, a force for change. And there's morale lessons that happen every night where this all gets reinforced. So that was interesting. The other thing is that it kind of gives a little bit of context to how the First Order had an opportunity to rise to power in the first place. And I think that's one of the things that Star Wars in general has not done a great job explaining the ins and outs of the First Order. We know from books like Aftermath, where the seeds were planted, that some of the people from the Empire went to the unknown regions and began rebuilding in secret. But they are going to these different worlds in the unknown regions and promising peace and stability and promising aid, and then making their services available to these various governments around. But it always comes at a price, and sometimes that price gets revealed when it's just a little too late for the planetary governments to do anything about it. Again, so there's a couple of examples here in this book that are definitely worth checking out. So beyond that, weaknesses, I do kind of feel like the characterization for Finn is not terribly consistent between the books and the comics. I thought this book did a good job keeping him in line with the character that we got to meet in Rucka's book Before the Force Awakens. But beyond that, there's a lot of comics where Finn is wholeheartedly a janitor, and he's portrayed much more as an elite trooper here. And so, again, maybe a nitpick here. Does it have the epic scale of, say, the movies or the High Republic books that we just covered in the past couple of years? No, I wouldn't say that either, but that's not its design. You could push back on what I'm saying by pointing out that many of the young adult novels in the High Republic were part of that larger tapestry and did have that epic scope, so why couldn't this? Well, that just wasn't this book's purpose. This book's purpose was to give us a personal story about Finn and Jannah and what their upbringing in the First Order is and what were the events that caused them to defect and become part of this resistance movement. And so it did a good job with that. So for my final non-spoiler thoughts before I get into some spoiler details, I guess I'd just say this. Who would I recommend this book for? If you are someone who enjoyed The Force Awakens, if you're someone who is fascinated with how the First Order kind of came to be, this provides some details. If you like Finn, this is a good book for you. If you just don't care for the sequel trilogy, then this is probably something that you could put aside. I'm giving it about somewhere between 4.5 stars out of 5. Out of that, this was a book that I was listening to on Audible and doing the Whisper Sync with reading it on Kindle, and there was a number of times that I'd get back from a dog walk and get through my morning chores before I had to start working for the day, and then I'd pull out the Kindle thing and read it a bunch. In that final day that I was reading it, which was just a day or two ago from when I was recording this, I picked up the book and just knocked out the last 100 pages in a go, and just because I had to see how things were going to end. So it's a good, worthy Star Wars book. No Jedi, no lightsabers, nothing like that. You're not going to see Rey. Poe does make an appearance, so if you're a Poe fan, that's a good opportunity to see him make couple of cameo appearances throughout the beginning of the book, especially. But so there you have it. So if you want to get some more of my thoughts on this that get into a bit more details, then stick around. Otherwise, I'll just wish you a good weekend and say thank you for listening to Podcast Stardust, and catch us next time. All right, spoiler thoughts. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of talk about Finn. Of course, we all know him as FN2187, and frankly, throughout most of this book, other than in the framing device chapters where he's Finn, he was always FN2187, and so sometimes he was just called 87. And he finds himself in this book, especially in the flashback scenes, and in a position where he's trying to find his place in the First Order. Now, I don't want to overstate that. It's not like he was wondering, but he had his goals. He wanted to be a mountain trooper, of all things. But during a competition, there is another clone cadet by the name of FN7155, or sometimes just 55, that he kind of comes into direct conflict with, and they start off as rivals, but then one of the villains of the book, Major Goal, the First Order, ends up selecting them both to be his bodyguards, his attaché, for missions that he's going on. And as you might predict, the rivalry ends up turning into something of a begrudging friendship over the course of the novel, as they end up looking out for each other or standing up for each other and the like. And Major Goal is really, he's corrupt is what it comes down to. And he's got things going on the side. And by implication, Captain Phasma does too. But the book does a good job avoiding spelling those things out exactly how she was involved, but you can read between the lines on that one. With Jannah, we get introduced to her as TZ1719. The rest of her squad frequently calls her boss, and they develop their own personalities. So we got Clamps, 12, and 214 that are the other members of her squad. I found, especially with the Jannah portions of the book, thinking back to the Clone Wars and the camaraderie that the clones would have, and how, even though that they had numbers, they would still develop nicknames for each other and still find a way to give each other individuality, which is practically in direct conflict with these morale sessions. The morale sessions, I should say, will start off with this type of a mantra. The you is dead, the I is dead. There is only we. You were discarded. I was abandoned. Your parents didn't want you. I was betrayed by my government. You are nothing. I am nothing. But we are strong. We are united. We are one. So that's what I was talking about earlier with the regimen that they go through. We're breaking down the individual and making them part of the larger whole. So yeah, despite that, the cadets were coming up with their own nicknames, so they were not constantly having to say, TZ1719, she got to be boss and whatever. And so I appreciated the parallel that Kwame and Mbalia developed there, whether knowingly or intentionally or not. I'm not sure. I haven't had an opportunity to read any interviews that he's done about the writing of this book, and I do look forward to checking that out. So that's one of the things I liked. There is this kid named Koi, who is a central figure in the framing chapters of the book. And as I talked about in the non-spoiler section, he comes from a planet where he worked on a tea farm, and this is what his family does. And so his grandfather is always imparting wisdom on him. And again, he's another teenager because it is a young adult book. And so he's kind of our point of view character for the chapters he appears in. And he gets sucked into this adventure. And as much as he pushes his back against it, he finds himself volunteering to do the next things. And so he's a fun character. I like him. He gets tied up in with another character that we come to know by the name of Nilla. She is one of the children that they find on the shuttle that has a bunch of kids that have been apparently abducted by the First Order and getting sent off to Major Goal for whatever he's going to do with them. And she comes along with Finn, Jannah, and Koi to track down Goal. And so she doesn't talk a whole lot, but there's some flirting that goes on between her and Koi, but not a whole lot. It's not going to be confused with a major teen romance of any type for certain. One of the things I really liked about this book was how it tied into other material that we received. And this is adult novels that I'm about to talk about. The Phasma book and the Black Spire book by Delilah Dawson that she wrote years ago. And one of the characters that was featured in there was Captain Cardinal. And he was kind of the First Order trooper that the cadets all reported to before they got turned over to Phasma. He was much more responsible for the education of the kids before they grew up and were assigned to squads and sent out to do battle. But he shows up a number of times throughout this book, and I remember being fond for that character. It's been a while since I've read either of those books, but it was good to see him here in this and create some of that continuity. Phasma shows up plenty in this book as well. She's not a major figure, but Jannah is constantly thinking back to her lessons and what it is that she would have advised her to do in certain situations. And she is pretty much as unforgiving and as ruthless as we all remember her. And so, again, drawing more continuity, really giving it this First Order fixation in the book, where we get into a bit of the culture, for lack of a better word, of what it was like to serve as a stormtrooper, to serve in the First Order, to be part of this thing, and to, they aren't aware, or they forgot, or they don't care that they were all children that were abducted by the First Order from their parents and then raised to serve in the First Order. Yeah, I just read that morale statement to you that, their parents didn't want them. Well, that's a lie. And so we go through this book hearing about how much good that the First Order is setting out to do for the galaxy and to repair it. And the kids grew up believing it because this is what they've been hearing their entire time. But as we get further through the novel, you get to see the cracks in the foundation of the First Order, that they are controlled by people who are corrupt, who are drunk on power, that should not be leading anyone. Major Goal, who is the villain that we talked about earlier, is a prime example of that. He's involved with smuggling children and creating, sowing corruption and profiting off this war himself. And then you've got Captain Shikra, who is a ruthless commander of a division or battalion, I'm not sure which, doesn't matter for the purposes of our discussion here. And he is all about the demonstrating to the galaxy that you do not resist the First Order, that they come in, they do things, you get in the way, you pay the price, and the price is very violent. So that comes to a head at the end of the book and leads directly to Jannah's decision to defect and take everybody else with her. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to tell you about this book. Again, I know for some readers, the idea of a young adult novel can be a bit off-putting because they view their reading level like way above that. But there really isn't much difference between a young adult book and an adult novel. I think the biggest difference is the protagonists that young adult books tend to focus on, which is, again, those tweens, teens, young adults, people that are not 18 years old yet. In the chapters that deal with Finn and Jannah, I think I may have said this already, in their training, they were 17 before they got selected and sent out here. And so, it's impressive from that point of view that kids this age were being asked to do things as advanced as they were. But that's one of the things that Jay and I have talked about quite a bit on this podcast, is that kids in Star Wars are given a whole lot more responsibility and made capable of doing things that we generally don't expect or ask of kids in our galaxy, fighting or piloting starships and the like, so there we go. But there we go. I'm going to end it there because I want to give you some thoughts on this, and the spoilers weren't really all that spoilers now that I'm thinking about it. I could have left that in the non-spoiler part of the discussion, but this is a book worth reading. There is a twist or two along the way that I think is worth preserving, and some of them you might figure out. I figured out one of the later ones myself before we got there, and there's some good clues that are dropped that'll help you figure those type of things out. I don't want to make this come off like it's a big mystery, but it doesn't have to be a mystery to have a twist. But it is definitely worth your time. So there you go. About, like I said, 4.5 stars for me out of 5. Okay, well, with that, just want to thank you all for listening to this episode of Podcast Stardust and my review of The Last Order by Kwame Mbalia. And I hope I got his name wrong. Apologies. I hope I got his name right. Apologies if I did not. I hope you've enjoyed my discussion of this book. And if so, I invite you to subscribe to the podcast on your podcatcher of choice. And once you've done that, please consider rating, reviewing, leaving comments, and the like. Those things help drive the algorithms and get us noticed by others, especially when you leave those reviews on Apple Podcasts. And then I'd also invite you to go check out more of the show over on retrozap.com. So your podcatcher's likely going to have 100 or 200 episodes of the show, but this is episode 1062. So we've got another 800 or so that you're not likely to find on any podcatcher, but they are there at retrozap.com with all the other great shows that are on the podcast network. And with that, I'd also like to remind you that, again, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust. That's our main two outlets for social media. Jay has set up Pinterest boards. I'm not even really sure what's on them because I don't engage in Pinterest, but she takes care of that for us. The show is available on audio format only on both YouTube and YouTube Music. And then if you want to reach us with longer, more drawn-out thoughts that are better suited for an email, reach us at podcaststardust@gmail.com. So also, we have a store where you can get our podcast logo. We have 7 different varieties of it on a t-shirt, stickers, and the things like that. And that'd be at TeePublic. I've got a link for that in the show notes as well. Upcoming on the show on Monday, we return to our Clone Wars rewatch with a discussion of episode 4 from season 4. That's a good one. We had fun discussing that. We've recorded that episode already. And then on Wednesday, it is the next entry in our Force Awakens series, celebrating its 10th anniversary, just a year late. And we got a great guest for that. So make sure you stick around for that one as well. All right. Thanks for listening to episode 1062 of Podcast Stardust, everyone. Have a fantastic weekend. And until next time, may the Force be with you.